Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Dr. Wliiam Bronston, and Dr. Bronston has written a very important book that he'd like to talk to you about. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Cynthia, very much. I really appreciate it. And good morning. The book that I wrote is titled Public Hostage Public Ransom Ending Institutional America. And it's a book that I worked on for over 50 years in order to craft. And it tells the story, essentially, of the way in which I coordinated a federal class action lawsuit for crimes against humanity against Governor Nelson Rockefeller and the administration, the state of New York, for running this essential American concentration camp for people with mental retardation called Willowbrook State School in Staten Island back in the 70s. The reason why the story is so profoundly important is because not only is that story a harbinger story of a major cancer in our culture, a major institutional cancer, but subsequent to that and subsequent to the efforts that we've engineered in more than 37 states against this kind of institutionalization, Medicaid has essentially plowed $6 trillion into institutionalizing our society, which means that every single one of us, all of us, sooner or later are going to have dependencies either in mobility or communication or cognition, or medical issues, whatever, and we will wind up being put into congregate, segregated institution, nursing homes, assisted living, and so on and so forth, without choice. Our society is completely riddled with institutional models, and they have to be ended once and for all. They are funded essentially by Medicaid. They are close to 70% privatized across the United States in every state. And the implication is no different than what was going on at Willowbrook State School, which was gigantic in size, but essentially had the same dehumanizing, anti-social, anti-family, anti-community agenda.
So I remember back in the 70s when Heraldo Rivera did the expose on Willowbrook. What prompted him to do that?
Heraldo was a very beloved friend of ours. He was working with us because we were organizing at the time in order to get equal pay for Native American licensed practical nurses at a federal public hospital in Staten Island. And my colleague, who his name is Mike Wilkins, was working at Willowbrook with me. I asked him to join me because I was struggling to organize and deal with the atrocities that I saw. Mike took a job there, and there was a job freeze. And as a result of his meeting with parents in order to expose the brutality on the inside of the institution, the administrator fired him and his social worker. And Mike called up Heraldo, who was a very, very close friend of ours, and told him about the situation. And Heraldo came with a cameraman and did this spectacular, explosive expose that showed up on ABC television. And it essentially catapulted him into national prominence. We subsequently did an incredibly powerful show with Dick Cavett, including Heraldo on the show, and my colleague, Mike Wilkins, and two mothers, and one of the residents that essentially had been sprung from the institution as a result of Mike's advocacy work. And so, it became a national scandal. And the power of his photography and his personal outrage and disgust and fury at the horror of what he saw in the institution essentially was really unusual. It was unusual for a journalist to take a bat and swing it at the way that Heraldo did. And it was really an extraordinary kind of a breakthrough for him career-wise and morally.
I see. So, how did you get involved? What made you interested in this particular area?
Well, my whole experience when I was in medical school was being a fellow in the the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. And my mentor was the head of the child development department at Children's Hospital. And his specialty was working with families who were concerned that their kids may have a developmental delay. And his agenda was to deflect any child, regardless of the degree of their special needs, from being institutionalized. His name was Dr. Richard Koch, and he was really one of the great leaders in the country in terms of advancing the whole strategy of how to work with families that had kids with developmental disabilities of one sort or another: autism, mental retardation, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, learning disabilities, and so forth. And he had this magnificent team consisting of a psychologist, public health nurse, a speech and hearing therapist, and himself as a pediatrician, in order to work with the families to keep the kid at home. And so all 4 years that I was in medical school, I worked with him during the summers and did research with him. And my whole orientation was anti-institutional. I mean, our commitment was absolutely to support community-based services for people with special needs in our culture. And when I essentially did my residency in psychiatry at Menninger's in Kansas, I moved to New York. And because I was a very active organizer while being a doctor, while I was in my residency program and in medical school, I knew that I had to try and find a job in a place that I was familiar with in terms of technology, and that would not check my background. I couldn't afford to have them find out that I was an organizer. And so this institution, I figured, would be a slam dunk. It was in a remote area of New York City in Staten Island. And so I applied. And of course, luckily, the administrator, who was a very pompous, kind of a guy, essentially loved the fact that I was an American, spoke English, was highly trained, understood the whole issue of child development. He hired me. And so I walked into this horrendous, I mean, incalculably horrible environment. There were institutions in California, but I only went to visit them and was appalled at the segregation and the dehumanization that existed even in more or less clean environments like we had in California, Pacific State Hospital, Napa State Hospital, and so on and so forth. But in New York, the New York system had no community-based services of any kind for people with special needs. They only had 30 monstrosity big institutions, starting at 200 beds and going to Willowbrook, which was at close to 6,000 beds when I got there. And my first job, I was just appalled because I came out of the most sophisticated child development medical environment maybe in the country. There were 600 to 800 specialty physicians behind Dick Koch in his department at Children's Hospital for somewhere in the vicinity of 100 to 120 beds altogether. And here I walk into an assignment where I had 200 of the most broken children you can imagine, with no staff, no services, no adequate clothing, no adequate food. The charts were absolutely opaque. I was just, I didn't know how I was going to find out who these children were that I was assigned to take care of at Willowbrook.
Okay, so the other doctors who worked there, were they as outraged as you?
No, what happens is that, first of all, most of those doctors were incompetent. They were mostly non-American trained physicians. They were older folks, and they had the same bias that the general medical community had towards mental retardation and developmental disability. They essentially saw what they were doing as status quo. They essentially were totally terrified at the patient population, at the resident population, because everybody in the institution had some kind of rare, terrible disease as a result of the poor hygiene of the place, hepatitis, various forms of gut diseases of some sorts, parasites and the like. And so the doctors never touched anybody. They required the workers to bring the individual that may have had a problem that the worker had to figure out and bring to the doctor in order to have treatment applied. And my agenda was to try and engineer conversations with the various doctors to look at the situation when a kid was dying or when a kid was terrifically sick, what we could do or do better in retrospect. And that infuriated the doctors. And I found, after trying to work with them, that they were absolutely part of the problem. And the lead doctors in the institution were totally tied to the politics of the state of New York and to maintain the status quo at Willowbrook. They were hiding in these jobs. They couldn't get a job outside of the institution in the normal medical community. They didn't have the chops to deal with that. And so my whole struggle there was to find a constituency that had a stake in change, and that were the parents. The workers were part of the problem as well, notwithstanding that many of them cared tremendously, but many of them were very corrupted by the imposition of the message of the institution as a facility that essentially determined their expectations and practices in the institution to dehumanize the people that they were working with.
So it was at that point, did you pick up the phone and say, hey, Heraldo, you better come down here and check this out? How did that come about?
So we contacted Heraldo when Mike was fired. Mike and Heraldo were very close. They were beloved friends and had been working together for a number of years before Heraldo became a journalist. He was a civil rights lawyer for the Legal Aid Society in New York. What we did was we began to try and clean the place up. We began to try and practice model medicine. I began keeping meticulous records of everything that I saw and explaining the implications of what I saw. Because when you're in a concentration camp like that, the standards of what you expect, what you see and what you understand are radically different than normal, radically different. And it took me a year of working in the institution to see that the institution had to be shut down. It was absolutely an impossible situation of cruelty and barbarism and antisocial practice that was a million miles away from good medicine, from anything that I had been trained or taught in my career. And so we began inviting parents into the buildings, which they were excluded from by the workers. Nobody in the institution wanted families to see the horror of what was behind the door, what was behind the steel doors in these large buildings that each held about 200 people in 4 wards of 50 persons per ward. And little by little, the families that were terribly timid, terribly guilt-ridden, terribly disempowered by the way in which the system treated them, kept them at bay, kept them outside of the buildings, never explained anything to them, and essentially, intimidated people because if they complained, they were concerned that their kid would be sanctioned in one way or another. And so little by little, as we began to retrain the workers on our own recognizance and begin working with the families, and the families began to meet each other and began to understand that what was going on with their kid being completely physically deteriorated over time was a common phenomenon of being in the institution. And my book essentially deals with the details, the intimate implications of that situation on the inside. It's a unique book in the sense that nobody, will again be in a position that I was in. I mean, I don't want to say was lucky, but I was able to be in the depth of the ugliness of the brutality and to be able to interpret it, explain it, describe it, and then essentially create a book for people working in human services in order to encourage them to be committed to health and social justice and to not be complicit with the kind of institutional policies that essentially dominated the culture in America, that dominate the culture in America with our gigantic nursing home industry that we are all subject to experiencing as we age.
That's true. That's very true. So from your experiences on Long Island, how
Staten
did
Island.
you, Staten
Staten
Island,
Island.
I'm so
Yeah.
sorry.
You lived in Long Island.
I'm from Long Island. How did the notion of single payer evolve with you?
What's clear to me is that our medical delivery system is a market system that is essentially organized to extract wealth from the working class. And what struck me was that the only solution to building a transformed disability community in America, of which there are about 40 million people with special needs in the US population, was to end the current medical delivery system that essentially impoverished people in order to make them eligible for any kind of coverage. Medicaid is one of the cruelest and most evil systems imaginable. It requires you to essentially be completely without money. You can only have about $2,700 worth of assets altogether in order to be eligible for Medicaid services. The rates that are paid by Medicaid are in most instances so low, because the people that are served by the Medicaid system are the devalued population of the United States. They're a surplus population that no longer is functional in a productive working class environment. And so the system has figured out how to monetize, commodify aging, commodify disability. And what we essentially were dealing with was how to make healthcare a right, how to end it being a commodity of any kind, how to eliminate cost at the point of any service, how to make sure that everybody had the public right and that the general population owned the medical delivery system and was not subject to it as a market operation.
In this country, somebody such as yourself who goes against the grain is ostracized,
Yes,
the pariah. How
yes.
can you overcome an entire system that's stacked against you?
Well, when you're struggling for health justice, you have the moral high ground. And I love being a doctor. I can't begin to tell you. I mean, I wanted to become a doctor as early as I can remember as a little kid. and I believe that struggling against evil, struggling against injustice, struggling against corruption is a winning game one way or another. I knew by myself that I could bring that place down because I was a skilled organizer and I knew not to stick my head up too soon and wait until I had a base in the general population of people that had a stake in the institutional, system. So my concern was that we must have a change in public policy so that healthcare is a human right, is a public utility, is a good, not a commodity. We cannot have people dependent upon their wealth in order to assure their well-being. And our system does not address healthcare. Our system is a wellness treatment mechanism that charges money. And if you don't have the money, you're SOL. I mean, it's absolutely intolerable. So the moral obligation to go against this evil is compelling for me. And I have hundreds and thousands of confreres, other physicians, other health professionals that are committed to this transformation. The California nurses, for example, are a major warrior organization, 100,000 strong, committed to single-payer healthcare legislation in the state of California. Pramila Jayapal, the congresswoman from Washington, Bernie Sanders, the senator, from Vermont, both have single-payer bills at the federal level. The problem, of course, that you point out is that all the money in the world is pitted against the change. And so the people of America have to understand what is in their interest and not be deflected or intimidated or terrorized by the marketing opposition of the major cartels, pharmaceutical, hospital, insurance companies, and so on and so forth, that essentially turn the dollar on the status quo. And we have to go against that. And my life's work through my death is going to be to struggle for this moral transformation that will change America at its most profound cultural basis.
A lot of people in this country to this day treat doctors like they walk on water.
We don't.
Right?
We don't. Of course, we don't. But that's part of the authoritarian model that the doctors have engineered since the beginning of the 1900s. We outlawed women in medicine. We outlawed all complementary medicine in deference to allopathic medicine, which is our medicine that's all poisons, all toxins. There's no medicine that we possess that essentially strengthens the body. Everything that we do essentially is a bullet fired at an enemy, whether it's a bacteria or a disease of some sort or another. And so our whole model of medical care is not public health, is not healthcare. And what has to happen in a single payer universal system is that we have to make the public health system the lead administrator for designing and delivering healthcare. Healthcare has to be returned back to the home. It has to be returned back to the community. We have to decentralize our major big empires, the giant hospital complexes that are in the billions of dollars of expense. We have to globally budget all professional health education at the post-secondary level so that year for year of tuition coverage, individuals would essentially be assigned to work in urban or rural areas that are underserved and don't have adequate comprehensive medical care.
I am a New York State. I worked for the New York State for 33 years, so I'm a retired employee, and I've got my good health care, good coverage. And a few months ago, I woke up and my whole my whole right side started going numb. So I called my significant other and I said, "You better get down here. I gotta go to the emergency room. I think I'm
Yeah.
having a stroke." So I went and they told me I had a blockage of my carotid arteries.
Wow.
So I had my left side done. Now I have to get my right side done. But after the surgery, they gave me all kinds of medications for, like cholesterol and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
I just felt that the medications were not suitable for me. So they don't treat individual people. They say, "Oh, this person has, carotid artery or whatever," and they give them a whole bunch of medications that might not agree with that person.
Right.
I think that's a terrible way to conduct business.
It's not healthcare. It's medical management. And it's medical management to end illness, not to produce wellness. Wellness hinges upon 90% social determinants in society: your job, your transportation capability, your education, the food that you eat. There's a whole range of social realities that essentially undergird health care in our culture. That's not what modern medicine is all about. Modern medicine is a market system aimed at extracting money in order to keep you more or less alive. And the questions and issues that you're talking about are a result of the gross lack of socialization in the medical education system. We don't have a large enough medical system to meet the need. And in large part, it's mostly white old guys like me that essentially don't have the right politics in terms of identifying with the people that we're taking care of as family, as our family. It's you're alienated from us. So the practice has to be radically changed. We need truly a revolution, a cultural revolution in our society, which will transform everything in the way in which our society works. It will address issues of climate, it will address issues of poverty, and it will address issues of well-being and essentially the energy and the power to contribute to society as civic agents, all of us.
I'm a baby boomer as you are,
Yeah,
and the baby boomers we're becoming more dependent on healthcare, and it's going to get worse.
right. There
And
is no healthcare, honey. You can't buy healthcare. It's not for sale. All that's for sale is illness care. Be clear about that. We do not have a healthcare system. And to refer to our system as a healthcare system essentially misinforms, misleads even the people that are using the terminology. We have a cruel, barbarous medical market system that's predicated upon extracting money to the point of death in the general population and essentially channeling all of us into segregated, congregate terminus. And my book essentially deals with that whole issue in the most intimate and poignant way imaginable.
what's the name of your book? Do you have it that you could hold it up and show everybody?
Sure, I do. It's called Public Hostage, Public Ransom, Ending Institutional America.
Okay. And where can they purchase it?
They can get it from Amazon or from Barnes and Noble or from eBay. It's available in any online resource that you can buy an individual copy. It's self-published. It's 380 pages. There's 80 photographs in the book that are arranged in 4 major chapters to show not grotesqueness or spectacle, but the violence of an antisocial environment on human beings. It's really it's a unique historical documentary, and I'm hoping that a movie gets made about the book, because there's a whole gamut of stories that are built into this narrative.
So, any final thoughts?
I'm very grateful for your opening to the conversation. And the thing that I think is important is that people have to begin looking at their own language and their own assumptions built into their language. We do not have a healthcare system. We have an illness system. We don't have a public health strategy. We have a medical illness management strategy. And the whole thing is predicated on extracting money from all of us at an ungodly level. That must be ended. It must be ended, and we must, regardless of the challenge against the oligarchs and the cartels that essentially are the moneymakers in this whole operation, we must overcome and take ownership of the medical delivery system and return it back to the home. The people must be the arbiters of healthcare, not the professional community.
So doctors today, they're part of the problem then.
Yes,
They're not
absolutely.
making waves.
They've been part of the problem since they got control of the market, since the early 1900s. The doctors have been committed to being very wealthy and very powerful, and you described walking on water. And so some of that is justified, but most of it is a result of market theater, market strategy, in order to have the unchallenged ability to charge anything they want to charge and to kind of be in power and in control. You understand that our first patient is a cadaver. I spent the first year of medical school essentially undoing a dead human being. And that's the prototype of what patienthood is in our culture. That has to be changed.
And do you foresee that happening anytime soon?
It's got to happen, hopefully, in my lifetime. I mean, I'm 84. I mean, I'm a pre-boomer, and I think that the situation is pregnant right now. I mean, the situation is so awful. The cost of medical care now exceeds $14,000 for every man, woman, and child in America on average. We're spending close to $4.8 trillion on medical services in our society. That's more than twice as much as any other country in the world is spending. And 30% of our population does not have coverage. They either can't afford insurance or they can't afford to use the insurance that they have because of copays and deductibles. That has to be ended. It has to be ended. We cannot continue in this barbarous, antisocial, anti-health, anti-community strategy that is being driven by this top 1%, the cartel wealthy, the Wall Street folks that are privatizing Medicare and Medicaid at a thunderous, speed.
What percentage of people in this country have no health insurance at all?
It run no health insurance. We're probably about 7 to 16% in that area, but there's an additional batch of people that reach up to 30% that can't afford to use what they have because they can't afford the copays and the deductibles. So we're talking about more than 1/3 of all the money that's going into medical services that essentially is not going to healthcare delivery, but is going into profits for the cartels.
Mm.
It's
sure.
It's astounding. It's a scandal. It's a scandal, Cynthia.
I'm sure as the presidential year unfolds, I'm sure you would like to come back on, hopefully, and talk about the election and how it's affecting people and their health.
I'd love to, my dear. I'd love to. Anytime you're comfortable in having me back to rant and rave, I'm there. I'm there for you.
Thank you. So you've been listening to Dr. Wliiam Bronston. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks, Doctor. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.